everybody. Welcome back to the Cognitive Dissonance Podcast with Mitchell Croot and Kristy Bohan. In this episode, we discuss evolution of language, metaphysical forms, behavioral conditioning, fundamental structure of reality, all kinds of things. We go a lot of different places in this discussion, and it was actually a very interesting and enjoyable conversation. So if you haven't checked out my Substack yet, go ahead and prepare with that first, and then the rest of it will make sense. Enjoy.
Cognitive dissonance is the perception of contradictory information and the resulting confusion and anxiety from the difficulty to resolve those contradictions. We are here to play in that realm of contradiction and cognitive dissonance. We are here to infect your mind.
I do think it's for the topic that we're about to dive into, like language and communication, we are on different sides of an ongoing debate, which I think is perfect. But it might be worthwhile to explain sort of our philosophy that we're coming in with and then dive into the topics.
Okay. Well, then frame out yours.
Right. So for language and communication, the kind of Bible for a behaviorist is the Verbal Behavior book by B.F. Skinner. And it's a huge book. I've never read it cover to cover, but I've had to reference it for all of my classes. So I've read most of it at some point. And he breaks down language in a way that nobody ever had before. And the typical way is like nouns, verbs, sentences. You speak English, I speak Spanish. And he broke it down into 4 different parts, 4 different verbal operants, which I can get into later. But the way that he broke it down has been so useful because you can use his model to teach someone who doesn't have any language to speak. And it's less about the actual word that you're saying and more about what's motivating you to say that word and what happens right after you say that word that will make you say it again in the future or make you not say it again. Like if you're 7 and you cuss and your parents slap you, you're not going to say that word again. Or maybe you will because it's fun to get in trouble and do some risks. So this is not something, by the way, that speech language pathologists will use to teach language. Sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. They use a slightly different model, which is neither here nor there. But if you're talking to a speech language pathologist and you start mentioning like Skinner and verbal behavior, they might not be familiar with it. So it is a little bit of a niche thing. It is not fully accepted or fully adopted into language and everyone who teaches language. But it's pretty pervasive. It's in a lot of areas.
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds to me like just like almost everything else with Skinner, it's classical conditioning. Right, the same way that Pavlov conditioned his dogs to salivate at the ringing of a bell is the same way that parents condition their children to use communication devices, one of which would be language. Is that accurate? Okay.
The key difference is that Pavlov just did pairing and Skinner took it one step farther. So Pavlov didn't have a consequence for when the dog salivated. They just did it, and that was the end of the experiment. For Skinner, he would pay attention to what happened directly after and see how that influenced if the dog salivated again or not. So it's classical conditioning is just what happens before the behavior. The bell rings, the dog starts salivating, and that's the end of it. And operant conditioning is the bell ring, the dog starts salivating, they get a treat. So it's a little bit more comprehensive and a little bit easier. Almost everything is operant conditioning, and very few things are purely classically conditioned, because something happens after everything you do. I mean, time moves forward, so there's usually a consequence in play. So that's the difference. But yeah, Pavlov did get the ball rolling for sure.
And see, I guess where I take issue with that is it's great as an explanatory device to explain processes with which I don't think it does a sufficient job of explaining the innate ability to. And I think that's where you and I are coming at this from different perspectives.
Yeah.
Because
it's almost purposely left out of like Skinner's perspective, because they are so reactionary towards what psychology used to be, which was like God gave you hysteria and you should pray about it type psychology. So he was adamant about not going deeper and considering like the self or things like that. And he was very strict about just keeping it in the environment and not going inward. And the last speech he gave was like a couple days before he died in like 1991. And the entire time he was begging people not to do introspection, not to look deeper, to stay in the environment, keep psychology pure. And literally some of his dying words were, don't do that. So it is deliberately left out. But I don't know, like if he saw where psychology was today, if he would feel the same way, because it's helpful to look inside a little bit.
Well, yeah, because this is, love him or hate him, this is what was revolutionary about Freud and then Jung, which I think we could frame Skinner's hard-nosed, rigorous reaction as historically reactive to that.
Yes.
Keeping everything in, because Freud was definitely that. If you allow people the opportunity to expansively talk uncensored, they will on their own stumble into the things that are causing them psychological distress. Right, that's that whole repression piece.
Mm-hmm.
And it's through that introspection that we can resolve any incompleteness or incoherency with our conceptual structures to have them more accurately map reality, which would reduce all of that cognitive stress that we have from that dissonance. Jung would take that a step further and say that we can use those abstractions to achieve the same thing or similar goals. Right. I think it was Freud famously said that a boy can't become a man until his father has died. Jung would say, yes, but we can abstract that. Like that is to a degree like what Christianity is founded off of. You have that model, right? That archetype of the hero, however you want to phrase it, of Christ. And it's through his death that it allows the opportunity for everybody else to step up one level. Now, how that applies to language, I'm going to kind of table that and jump over, because I think that while the framework that you're coming from is accurate and useful, I feel it is a little reductionist in the sense of it runs the risk of reducing the totality of human experience to responses and reactions to inputs. Essentially, it takes any semblance of human agency out of the equation. Obviously, and obviously that's the extreme end, and most people don't go down there. But just like a couple of the other philosophies that I take issue with, if we follow it to its logical conclusion, right? The only reason that we learn language is because either our environmental conditions or our internal conditions necessitate it. The only reason it's necessitated is because we have these motivations or external motivations, right? All of that creates an image to me of people. Right, that whole a force in motion will stay in motion unless acted upon by an external force. Right, yeah, I picture if we didn't have these motivations to drive us to learn these skills, such as language, then what would Skinner say we are? Just a flat monochrome line of existence. And I don't think that's accurate, because organic life is too dynamic, constantly chasing and unable to perpetually maintain that homeostasis. Right, we're constantly out of balance. There is no flat line to organic life. Right, I think that's where I would draw the line there. That is, of course, assuming that I'm framing their argument properly, and my argument as a response to that is being framed properly too.
Yeah. And the reason, Skinner really saps the fun out of it because he didn't want anything that wasn't based on data. And I can write down how many times you blink, and I can see that, and two people can come to a conclusion that that's what happened. You blinked 3 times. But some of that other stuff, these days you probably could see it on an fMRI. We probably have ways, very expensive ways, to get accurate data on them. But most people don't. Like, if I were to do a study on language, I would only look at what you said and how you said it and stuff that's observable. And anything else that's going on is not something I would be able to put into my equation. So I'm just going to ignore it, which is just a way to do it. And your research is going to come out pretty good that way. But you could say there's a hole in that. But so do you think language is like an effortful act that humans do, or is it more just an innate part of what humans do?
I think the ability to be communicative is innate. How that ability manifests depends. So one of the articles I read in preparation for this is a professor of linguistics, Salikoko Mufwene, and I probably butchered his name, but it's pretty fantastic. And what I like about it is he starts off kind of like how we did, where he recognizes that there were both the truly abstract and the truly grounded scientists that were trying to explain language, right? Chomsky being one of them. Right?
Yeah.
So Noam Chomsky's, he called it the universal grammar organ, or the language organ, right? That we kind of have this biological primer.
Yeah.
But then he
famously hated Skinner's ideas. It's great.
And he kind of left it at that, though. He didn't take it a step further. So this is what I liked about this article. It's language as cultural technology, where because we have that biological primer to be communicative, right? It's built into our DNA and our biology as a social species. The particular ways that communicative ability manifests in language depends on the cultures that it's manifesting in. It also those cultures depend on those inputs from that cultural artifact of language, right? So it's like tandem skydiving, where you have the two people tied to the one chute, right? We have culture and we have language, and they're both a product of our innate biological primers, but they feed into each other in feedback loops, right? So we inherit this language rooted in all of these cultural understandings, and we can get to this later about language as memes, right? That the same fundamental function as memes. But then we can use that cultural inheritance to more or less direct the parameters of the culture that we are leaving as an inheritance for our future generations.
That makes a lot of sense, because it's looking at the environment that your language comes from, and there's not really a way to separate those two. Like,
No.
You grew up with a palm tree, so you have a word for palm trees. If I were not in a place that had palm trees, probably wouldn't come up with a word for that and pass it down to anyone, because it's going to be a reflection of what you're doing every day.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's important too, because reading this article and but I think I remember where I was heading with this, so let me pick up on this train of thought so it's a little bit more seamless when I edit this out and we jump back in. And I wrote, I don't know if you saw, I wrote a piece on my Substack about this. Speaking of which, I don't know how often you write, creatively or not, but if you do, I suggest starting a Substack. It's free. At the very least, it's like a digital archive, and I use it for a lot of things. A lot of my undergraduate and graduate level essays and research papers I've put up there. And I think I'm going to put my master's thesis up there in like 10 parts or something like that, you know, chunkable and readable.
Yeah.
But so audience, if you're listening, if you haven't read my Substack yet, go over there and read it first, because it'll prime you for what I'm about to talk about here, because we get a little deep. And Mufwani brings this up. He talks about it from a biological sense, but I abstract it out and do one level higher of analysis, that the potentials of action within any system are naturally and inherently bounded by the parameters of that system. Scaling it down, particularizing it a little bit more, what I mean by that is the reason we have certain sounds for certain things is partly because of the cultures that it arose in, but also partly because of biological limitations. We can only, like the larynx can only make so many different sounds at once. The human tongue can only articulate so many different sounds at once, and those parameters naturally bound the extent to which we can articulate words. On top of that, the language processing unit in our brains is bounded too. At the very least, we have response times and all of the fine tuning of the neurophysiology to process and then respond to things. But it's still, it's bounded, at least in some capacity. We might have wiggle room within those bounds, but it's still there. That's what I was going to bring up earlier about the biological piece.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it is shaped by how you grew up in the culture that you're in. And a good example of that is the sound R and the sound L, ul and
Mm-hmm.
For people who grew up hearing that differentiation, it's easier. It sounds very different to me. But to people who grew up speaking Mandarin, it doesn't sound that different, and it can be hard to hear ul versus because they're both kind of sounds. So you will hear people who speak Mandarin and English as a second language mixing those up, which is kind of stereotypical, like if you're going to do a Chinese accent and be racist about it, you're going to flip those around.
Mm.
But it comes from their learning history of, I, as an English speaker, learned to differentiate those, and they didn't, and they still could with more practice, but it's really fresh for them, a couple of years being fresh in language versus a lifetime. So it can, I don't know, like we're all given the same tools, but you got to sharpen that sword or else you won't be able to do it.
Well, and then too, and I tend to frame a lot of my thinking in complex systems or complexity theory. So, and this is a perfect example of what we have here. We have one of the articles I read, they call it dual patterning, where we have the cultural bounds that dictate the extent to which language will form. And then we also have the inherent binding of where that culture originated too. So like you mentioned earlier, if you don't have palm trees in your natural environment and your family, your ethnicity has been in that same spot for generations, you're not going to have a word for that because you don't experience it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And then as you develop, once you do move out, say you branch out and you start experiencing those things, you operate within your cultural inheritance to develop a new word to fit into that language. It's still bounded by that cultural parameter too.
Yeah. It's like the French word for potato is like ground apple or something.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like they're going off of what they know when they came up with the word for potato. An apple, something you eat, comes from the ground. And it was like, you obviously from that can infer they had apples and they had ground before they ever met the potato. Yeah. So you can see kind of the etymology and the evolution of, language through what you come up with when you meet something new.
So let me ask you this then. Using your operative conditioning and behaviorist framework, what was the first classification of words? Verbs or nouns?
So this is a tough one because the words that I would use to classify language are manned, tact, echoic, and interverbal. All these are words that Skinner just made up to label the ideas that he had. And so a manned, like the root word of that is like command or demand. Mm-hmm. So when you manned, you're asking for something. Tacting is labeling. So when you tact, you're giving it a name. Echoic is you're echoing, you're repeating what someone said, even yourself. And an interverbal is your response to someone else's verbal behavior, like answering questions, nodding and saying, like those things are interverbals. And that's a very high level skill. But the first word that humans came up with was probably a man asking for something. So it could have been water, and that person was requesting water or asking for water. It could have been run. That person was asking to run, requesting that someone else run. So I think very strongly that it was not two people coming together and saying, let's call this an apple. That the first person to come up with the word did it because they wanted that thing. And it was not an act of people, let's simplify our lives and come up with a name for this so that we can communicate better. But it was an act of, I need this and I need someone to know that I need this. So it could have been a verb. The only one that I could think of, like when I take myself back to very, very prehistoric, like early humans, I could see run, I could see water, I could see food as kind of your first three options of what the first word was that people came up with. But I'm fairly certain it wasn't just a label to just say, let's call this a tree. And they moved on with their lives and just started labeling everything. Because the reason I think that is the first word that babies say is usually a man asking for something. So it would follow that the first word that any human ever said was also a man.
But don't those mans refer to a label?
Yes. Yeah, you could have water as a man. If I say water, I want my water, I'm going to take a drink. If I look at my water bottle and I say water, then I'm same word, different operant. So that's attacked. If you say water and then I say water, that's echoic. If I read water and I say the word water because I read it, that's a type of echoic. And if you ask me what my favorite drink is, I could say water, and that's an introverbal. So yes, the same word could function as all of those, but the reason that someone is saying it kind of gives it the classification rather than what that word is referring to.
Okay, that's fair. We'll come back to motivations and point of origin for reference, because I have a decent amount to say about words referring to other things. Postmodernist Jacques Derrida gave me a lot of ammunition for that. But let's return to, I think...
Well, do you think it was a label, the first word?
If I had to place a wager on it, I think it was a label. Because, right, so you bring it up a good point that a toddler's first word is a man. They're
Usually
asking for, demanding, searching for something along those lines. And that's why I brought up earlier that those man's command could be for something, a label. If we, right, you watch how toddlers that don't have verbal language yet, they're still in, and this is where I see that we have the biological primer for being communicative, because they don't have verbal language, but they still have body language.
They get their point across.
Dude, nothing enraptured me more in the toddler stage than how fluid and plastic language is. If you think that language isn't fluid and plastic, go hang out with a 2-year-old for 2 hours. By the end of the 2 hours, you guys will understand each other.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not linguistically, but you guys can understand each other. And most of how pre-language individuals operate is by gesturing. They might have grunts and things like that to add emphasis to stuff, but it's primarily gesturing. Well, what are they gesturing at? Maybe, there might be motivations behind it. I need to get over there. I need to run from this predator or whatever, but there's still that fundamental label as the origin of, right? They are trying to draw the other's attention to something. Mm-hmm. And it is through that direction of attention, I think, that those first words started being applied as labels with which to ease that process.
It does make sense that way. Maybe the first word was look. Come on. Look.
Well, and see, that's interesting, because that's an action, not necessarily a label. It is a label, but it's a label of doing something.
Yeah. Well, it's a man because you're requesting that this happen. Look. That would be I like that one now. That was not on my list of what I think the first words could have been, but now it definitely is, because what you said makes sense, that there was a gap in, or maybe a delay. It took too long to get on the same page. So to streamline that process, we came up with something quicker, which is very fast. Like, that's why most people use vocal verbal language, is because it is a great method to communicate. And it's considered like the best method. And then everything else, like including ASL, is like subpart of that. And considered, I would never say that ASL is not on the same level as vocal verbal behavior, because it's equally fast, possibly faster to get the same point across. But it is not as, it requires you to look. So there's one more step to that vocal verbal language doesn't need.
Yeah, that's a good point. I had a thought. Let me see if I can pull it back. Oh, so the intention for a first word might have been a mand. Look at that. Get me this. I need this. We need fire. Mm-hmm. The evolution of that, it sounds like, from that origination point onwards, is echoing. Right, because once I draw your attention to something, to maintain that efficiency of drawing your attention to it again, or for you to draw my attention to it, if like the roles are reversed, what are you going to do? Or you're going to mimic how the first person was gesturing towards that, which means you would now mimic how they're vocally gesturing towards that, and then you're going to build your linguistic structures off of that.
I think you could see that process today. I'm imagining, like, I go to a German grocery store and I see a type of fruit I've never seen before, and I call the German lady over and I like point, and in English I say, "What is that?" And she looks at me and she says like "anana," and I go "anana," and she goes "anana," and then I go "anana." So we've said the same word 4 times, but she tacted it, she labeled it, I echoed it, then I tacted it, and I labeled it correctly. So the first "anana" I said was an echoic, trying it out, getting her approval, that was right, and then me saying it for real as a tact. And I imagine that happens all the time. And I imagine a very similar sort of back and forth of, did I hear that right? Did I say that right? Happened. I mean, why wouldn't it happen that same way?
Especially when there's no rules, right? Going back before standardized language. Right? Even just reading historical documents from colonial America in the 1650s, it is twice as difficult, not because their handwriting was so sloppy, which it was, but because there was no standardized English. So they spelled things however they thought it was supposed to be spelled.
I love
you can have the same person. One of the primary focal points of my master's thesis was a guy named Herman Husband. And the verdict is still out on whether it was Herman or Herman, because he spelled it both ways in his writings, and whether it was husband or husbands, because he spelled it both ways sporadically throughout his writings. And I mean, it's not like I can go back in 1771 and ask him, "Hey, yo, Herman, how was it?"
Yeah. Well, he might even, like, if you ask him which way is the right way, even that might be a foreign concept. Like, what do you mean the right way? Like, you know what I said. Why does it matter? Because I used to teach kids with dyslexia how to read and spell and stuff. And if we could get to a point where it was close but not correct, like, I spent a lot of time building up that self-confidence. Like, listen, you did your job. They can read it. You didn't spell it right, but all of the sounds are in the right order and they're there. So, like, if I spell bread, B-R-E-D, but I mean the food bread, but in the context of the sentence, you know it's not bread like a dog, then you're good. You did it. And that's been my philosophy, just with people with learning disabilities. Like, my experience is, you know, if your brain's not going to do it, but you get pretty close, that's their problem if they want you to be right. So it may be a newer concept that you have to be correct. You have to learn it one way, a certain way, because, you know, 1 in 5 people have dyslexia. It's extremely common. So the fact that we put them to this standard of being perfect, having it memorized, is possibly not what we were doing 100 years ago.
Well, and that's a conversation that we can have too, where, because we need standards, we need a starting point, we need some sort of mutual footing with which to orient and initiate all of our social engagements,
Mm-hmm.
to orient and initiate our interactions with the world. However, by definition, standards are restrictive and oppressive.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That is the whole point of standards. And in fact, we could argue that is the whole point of language, is to be exclusionary. The reason I can say the word cat and you and I instantly have at least overlapping images in our head of what we're talking about is because we also at the same time have an understanding of all the things that word does not refer to, which helps clarify what it is, right? It bounds and binds whatever it is that we're referring to, which we have to, because if I say tree, right, you have to have some idea of orienting what I'm referencing, you know. But also at the same time, right, it is, the postmodernists are correct in this. This is their kernel of truth there, that by definition, it is exclusionary, right? By definition, applying a label to something, even something simple as drink, right? It, by definition, excludes all of the things that aren't in that. Now, where the postmodernists would take this too far, or at least a postmodern ideology would take this too far, is all things exclusionary and oppressive need to be dismantled, right? Which leaves us in just that quagmire of infinite subjectivity with zero way to orient ourselves towards anything mutual, right? Because, I mean, this is... Well, not to, let me just say this piece, and then I want to hear your thoughts on that. Not to get too political too quickly, because I don't want this to be a political channel or a conversation, but this is the issue with all liberation theologies, regardless of flavor or origin. To have a worldview based on liberating yourself from oppressive boundaries ignores the fact that oppressive boundaries are baked into the nature of reality. No matter how much I want to envision myself as a hot air balloon, gravity is going to keep me on my feet on the ground. No matter how much I want to be liberated from, no matter how much I want to have total freedom within a system, I still have to eat. That bounds the freedom with which I still have to sleep. I still have biological needs that I have to attend to, whether I want to or not, which by definition is oppressive, but there's no, what's the alternative? You know, if you want total freedom from an oppressive system, the only, and I'm not advocating for this in any capacity, so nobody take this out of context, but the only way to really be oppressed from, to be free from an oppressive system is death.
Yeah. I don't know. It comes from a very egocentric view of the world, because humans are social creatures. We exist as a species because we influence each other, and you don't always get to be the one influencing. You are influenced back by other people, and that's how it's supposed to be. If you take a person and put them in solitary confinement, they will go insane. They will not survive. We are not supposed to be that way. And it can be uncomfortable to be influenced by other people and to be aware of it, but it is a non-negotiable part of our species as animals. It would be like if the lion in the pride is like, I don't want to be with y'all. I'm going to go do my own thing. You guys are oppressive. Like, I hate this pecking order. I want to eat first. That lion goes off and dies because it needs its group. And if you're human, the same thing happens. You go off to the woods because you don't like waiting in line for food and you don't think you should wear the clothes that people ask you to wear. You go off into the woods and you die alone. And that's what happened to everyone who thought that way, which is why most people are very open to other people's opinions and following those social rules. Like, we walk into a restaurant and we see what other people are doing and copy them. And it's not as, it's very quick. You might not even be aware that you're doing it, but you can find the end of a line in a grocery store pretty easily by just looking at what other people are doing. And we are meant to do that. And the fact that it inconveniences you is very selfish to view it that way.
Yeah, and I think, and we've had this conversation before, not on the podcast, but before, about internal locus of control versus external locus of control. I think that plays in too, right? It might not even be a selfish disposition per se, but just to have the perspective that you're, like Heidegger would say, that thrownness, right? We're thrown into a world. We don't get to choose our parents. We don't get to choose our culture. We don't get to choose the region that we're raised in, right? And to be thrust into a system like that makes it generates within a lot of people this idea that there's nothing within their control that can make those things better, or that can change it to their particular ideal outcome, right? Therefore, that system, those conditions, whatever they have that thrownness of being thrust into, is, because it is by definition, a binding and oppressive force. But the rub is that, just like you said, it is necessary. It's necessary biologically, right? Because like you alluded to, and I'm including psychology with this biological piece, that there's a reason we have the stereotype of the crazy hermit that lives alone in the woods, right? They're crazy because they don't have their normal psychosocial interactions with which to regulate themselves. But also, too, it's essential in the sense of having heuristics, having that starting point with which to engage with the world. If we don't have a starting point, right, you can't engage with the world. If you can't engage with the world, you die. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Like that's the way the cookie crumbles, people.
Yeah. And whether or not it should be that way, it is that way. And maybe in 1,000 years, I mean, not even, because how fast does evolution take place? If human beings last 1,000,000 years, we might see a change in, the way that our evolutionary social creatureness occurs. But it's not happening this year or next year or before any of us die. So we're stuck with what we have.
Just like we were talking about earlier with the particulars of a system being restricted and bound by the parameters of that system, right? We exist in a particular embodiment, which means the nature of our experience, while there's lots of wiggle room and lots of room for difference and variation, that experience, the totality of it, is still bounded by our embodiment, and there's no escaping that. If we do escape that, then by definition, we're not having a human experience anymore, because we're not an embodied human being.
I also do, part of the rub with talking about language is that there are people who, what am I trying to say? Like, it's an integral part of being a human, but there are people born without the ability to acquire language because of their autism or their brain damage or something that happened genetically. And it is, those are humans. That happens. That's part of our evolution. Those traits haven't died out in all of our evolution. They're still here. So there is that says something because it's a variation that nature keeps giving us for a reason. So there is, I don't know, I guess I just want to say it's tough to talk about language when you know that this is something that humans do. It's part of our evolution, but there's always an exception. Not every human. And then there are people like Skinner would say everyone can learn language no matter what's happened. And this is kind of proven true. I don't know if you've seen the dog called Bunny, who she's part of a study now, but she's a sheepadoodle, like kind of a big, curly, cute dog. Mm-hmm. And her owner has trained her to use a button board, and each button has a recorded word. And the owner has trained her to press these buttons, string them together in sentences. There's question, there's excitement. She has named her parents there, like she can say like mom and dad. She can ask for food with this button board. And there's what they think they're doing, what these dog parents think they're doing is discovering that dogs have the same power to acquire language as humans have. That's not what's happened. What's happened is they have done very impressive operant conditioning to train this dog to speak in sentences using an assistive technology. And it is it is highly, highly impressive conditioning that they've done. This dog is not using language. It can't use language. It's not using English. But they think that that's what they're doing.
Because initial response is, at what point does rote repetition turn into manipulated cognition? Mm-hmm. Or I guess a better way would be linguistic cognition. Right? Just because you've trained the dog that when they press this button, they get water, or they press that button, they get treat, and then there's a verbal command that's laid over the top of that, that doesn't necessarily mean that that dog is using linguistic cognition. They're using,
it's definitely not. Dogs can't do that.
Yeah. They are communicative, which is why we can do that overlap. They are conditionable because they're communicative.
Right. I was going to say they're very sensitive to our reactions, which is why they're easy to train.
And B, they do have that language element, but it's nonverbal. You can use the different pitches of whines and howls as rough indicators, but for the most part, the primary mode of language for most mammals is nonverbal. Mm-hmm. Right? So you watch two dogs in the backyard before they start playing, and it might be really quick, but one of them does what's called the play bow. That's why when you're standing in your living room and you go, your dog starts freaking out, because that's what you've just simulated. You just simulated the play bow. If you watch them really quickly, the dog initiating play will do that dip and then crazy. And that lets the other dog know that it's not an act of domination. It's not an act of reestablishing the pecking order. It's fun.
Yeah.
Now, and again, we can go back to at what point that cocktail of communicative ability and rote repetition turns into linguistic cognition.
Yeah.
I don't have an answer for that, but that's just naturally, that's the next spot that my mind goes to.
What Skinner would say is it never does. And my extremely complex use of language if you had every data point of my life and you were able to graph that, you would know my verbal abilities based on what I've experienced, and that at no point does a word that you learn or a language or phrase or the way that I communicate, my cadence, my tone, every part of that has been at some point trained or practiced, or I tried it and I got a good reaction, so I did it again. With the, like, I couldn't change my voice too much, but you know, your accent, the way that you talk, like I could have a really high voice but you know, I have a more neutral one. In my opinion, it's neutral. Or I could talk a little bit lower and be a little bit more masculine. All of that is within my vocal ability, but I've chosen this one. And if you had every data point of my life, you could predict this is how she will talk. This is the volume, this is the cadence, this is the speed. And I think if you had a supercomputer that could do that, it would be accurate every time if it was measurable. And it's something fun to think about, because does it just come from something outside of the environment? In my opinion, probably not. It's always going to come back to, I was trained to do this, and trained being a very rough term for it. But over my life, this is what's happened because of the consequences of that I've been experiencing.
Yeah, there is truth there. I don't know the extent to how much, but there is truth there, and I agree with most of what you said, and I agree with most of Skinner's conclusions, at least in methodology for how things are acquired, because we do know that we adapt and adopt ourselves to the social conditions we find ourselves in. Mm-hmm. Part of that is a survival reflex. If you walk into a biker bar, you're not going to act a certain type of way because you know that it's dangerous, vice mm-hmm. versa. Right, and it is the input from those social mores and folkways. It is the social signals that our peers give us that let us know, like, how does a high schooler determine something's cool? Well, it's based on how many other people they've engaged with that have said that it's cool, right? And that's as deep as it goes for them.
The important thing is, too, that these connections and these trainings can happen when you're aware of them, but they can also happen when you're not aware. And there's a lot of studies, and especially like social research, that prove that you do not have to be aware that you're being conditioned in order to be conditioned. I can train someone to speak higher and have a higher tone of voice if every time you speak at a slightly higher tone or pitch. I think if you speak at a slightly higher pitch, I lean in and I nod a little bit more. I give you that feedback. You're going to speak to me with a higher tone, whether or not you're cognizant that I'm training that out of you. And that, so that's proven that you can train someone without them mm-hmm. knowing. So you're not always aware that this is how you were trained, which is pretty helpful for my argument, because most people would say they weren't. This is just how I do it. This is how I prefer to do it. But if you're taking the behaviorist perspective, you would say, well, you prefer to do that because of you were trained to do it that way.
Yeah, where I'm struggling to buy, and this is what's always turned me off about Skinner, is because I do view that while mostly complete, his perspective is reductionist. Mm. Now,
you're not alone in that. He's polarizing.
Well, I've yet to decide, because this kind of tiptoes down the free will debate, which we will have to do for a different episode because there's just too much to say there. But yeah. it makes, I haven't decided if I adhere to the human agency in the free will piece that Skinner leaves out because I want there to be that piece there, or if it's because I have another justifiable reason to be at odds with that. I haven't worked that out yet. But I do know that, like, for instance, if everything about a person, every measurable metric that you have is conditioned, operatively conditioned, either through internal conversations, right, in my head thinking, man, my throat's kind of parched, I need to go get some water, and then that spurs the behavior to go get water, which could spur the creation of the linguistics needed to tell someone else that I'm thirsty and I need to take a break and go get some water. Then where does intuition come from? Where does insight in revelatory knowledge come from?
My problem with the research on insight is that they did a lot of it with monkeys and then said only humans can show insight in higher primates. And by showing it in monkeys, you're really undermining your point that this is a human thing. So there's a amazing study where they observed insight in chimpanzees because they tied bananas to the ceiling and they had a box in the room and they let the monkey in, and the monkey really wanted the bananas, couldn't get it, wasn't tall enough, couldn't jump that high. And he looked around the room and he looked at the box, he looked at the bananas, he looked at the box again, and then he tried something new. And they've raised this monkey from birth. They knew he didn't have this skill. He had never showed it before. He had never been trained to do it. He's never seen anyone else do it. He came up with it on his own, and he showed a very human insight to doing it. And so this was a great sort of win in the cognitive psychologist category, saying insight is a human phenomenon. But to me, you did it with a monkey. It's an animal phenomenon. But anyways, there was a follow-up study with the exact same thing, but with pigeons, which definitely don't have insight. They have brains the size of a fingernail. And they did the same thing, put the pigeon in the box. The pigeon looked at the box. It looked at the ball that it wanted to peck. It looked at the box again. It used its beak to peck the box. Then it hopped on the box, and then it got the ball that it wanted. And the exact same thing trained in a pigeon. And the idea was that you say this is insight, I say this is operant behavior still. And it's the most insane. I think it's insane. The videos of the monkey doing it and the pigeon doing it, it really looks like the pigeon is thinking and then has an idea. And it's obviously not, it's a pigeon, but there are these things that you and I see as, oh, that was special, that was insight, but it might not be. It might just be how you were trained still.
Okay. Is there a issue with definitions then? Or reframing this the right way? Because you're describing novel behavior. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if that's what I mean by insight. So I might be using the wrong term on my end.
Okay.
I don't really want to use intuition either, because I think much of our intuitions, or many of our intuitions, are informed by our unconscious reading of our social mores and folkways. Right? How did the bank teller just have the clairvoyant image that the bank was going to be robbed? Well, they unconsciously picked up on either, a sensory chemical change in the environment, people's body language shifted in those micro expressions, and they just intuitively picked up on it, right? There's some input coming into the system there with intuition that can make it a little wonky. But
yeah.
What about revelatory? and I'm defaulting to insight again. Let's just use insight as a placeholder term.
Okay.
Until I can think of the better one. Revelatory experiences. So there's a couple different ways we can chart this one out. Religious experiences. You go to a place, you sit down, everything else is normal, and then all of a sudden, you get hit with that, and all of a sudden you have, to some degree, a more enlightened framework, worldview, schema, however it is you want to frame that. Another way that I'm thinking about this is overcoming writer's block. Right. So, and I know you have experience with this because you have 2 degrees as well, most of which required a lot of reading and writing to some degree. Right.
Yeah.
Right. So you're saying, and I explain this to my students a lot, that a blank page is infinite possibility. That's what writer's block is. It's choice paralysis. Mm-hmm. There's literally an infinite amount of things that you can say and an infinite amount of directions that you could go on a blank page. That's why the last paragraph or 2 of a paper is the easiest to write, because we're talking about the systems binding the operation within that system. As you get to the end of that paper, right, you've laid down all of those foundational bricks to where the options with which it can go are so narrowed that it writes itself. Mm-hmm. Now, scroll back though, you're sitting there, you're staring at the blank page, having writer's block, nothing's popping up. And all of a sudden, you get that spark of insight and it flows. Nothing's necessarily changed in your environment. Nothing's necessarily conditioned you, at least short term, at least locally, to have that spark of insight. But your cognition fires in such a way as to reveal to you seemingly internal pre-existing knowledge that you didn't have access to before.
Mm-hmm. That you can see that phenomenon on an EEG reading. Your brain waves going from kind of flatlined to active when you have an idea. It is observable. And so I say that to say, like, you know, behaviors only want to deal with observable stuff. That is observable to us today. We can see that happen. So it must fit in with behaviorism somehow.
Only if you have confirmation bias.
Right. So I can observe that. And the way I would answer that, like, why does that happen, is there's a stimulus within your own thoughts that you may or may not be aware of that sparks the next idea. And there is patterns of reinforcement that you can do to train novel behavior. They've done this in dolphins, where they give a signal and the dolphins have to do a series of tricks they've never done before. And this is something we do with people with autism, because specifically for conversations, it can be very, like, you know, they have very preferred topics, special interests that they like to talk about. And so doing this set of reinforcement can reinforce having new conversations, which can be a little bit scary if you have autism and you like things a certain way, you like conversations to go a certain way. So this is, it's something that people are able to do. If you ask me to train someone to have novel ideas right now, I would say I'm not competent enough to do that. But I mean, they're doing it with dolphins in SeaWorld right now. So it can be done. You can prove that this occurred because of training as well. But with humans, we're extremely complicated beings, and our learning history is extremely complicated as well, which is why our complex behavior appears to come out of nowhere. But if I had a strong enough computer and I had enough data points, I could predict that you would overcome this writer's block in this way. And I don't know if I fully believe that, but that would be the answer I would give. And the reason that I don't fully buy into that is because it's extremely theoretical. Like, well, if I can measure it, then I could tell you what happened. But I don't know what's more likely. Like this was a spark from God, or was it something from the environment? I don't know what makes more sense.
Two things. Well, two things. Well, I guess that's another topic for another episode. Qualia of God, right? We can write that one down. But no, two things. So, firstly, we know at least the human body we are a whole that's greater than the sum of our parts. And by that, I mean we have potential, we have inherent knowledge, even if it's just genetic knowledge, that isn't unlocked or accessible until placed in certain situations. So here's an example. We know, and it's been confirmed, that when placed in novel environments, the human body starts synthesizing proteins that it's never synthesized before. Right? You do. That's why when you can, you need to clear your head or you get writer's block. You go to Starbucks and you get a cup of coffee, and all of a sudden you're thinking differently because you're having a physiological reaction to that novel environment. Mm-hmm. Right? I don't know which side of the argument that suggests yet. Right. So I think I'm kind of on the fence about it like you. I don't want to be dull and drab and be like, everything boils down to numbers, blah, 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 blah. Everything's predictable. Because if everything's predictable and the totality of our experience is just the sum of our conditioning, then what's the point?
Yeah.
Right.
It would imply that there is no free will if I can put you in a computer and predict your next move exactly.
It would also imply that evil people aren't evil, that people don't make bad decisions. There is no morality. There's no such thing as good or bad. There is no such thing as human agency. If I'm a dick, it's because I was conditioned to be a dick. If I'm the Pope, it's because I've been conditioned to be the Pope. There's no inherent value to anybody that way, or even the potential for inherent value. But the other thing I was going to say too, if all of our linguistic abilities, and then by extension our psychological capabilities, are purely the results of conditioning, measurable outcomes, no such thing as transcendence or revelatory or insight or anything like that, where does consciousness fit? Because the whole idea of consciousness is at odds with that purely reductionist framework.
It's a tough question, because does my dog have consciousness? Because I see a lot of things that would imply that he does. He has dreams. He gets scared. He gets happy. He has favorite things and he has least favorite things. He doesn't like the rain. He's afraid of the buses when they drive by. All of this feels like he's a conscious being as well. But what a lot of people are resistant to is to put us on the same level as animals in that way. So they would say, no, dogs don't have consciousness, only humans do. And I don't see why a dog having consciousness takes away from humans are special. I'm not
Yeah,
sure
well-
that humans are special. I think we're animals.
Well, and here's the thing too. Why does it have to be all or nothing? Right.
Yeah.
It's you're either lights on consciousness or not. And I'm going to use my lighting as an example, right? Maybe that's a dog's consciousness. And this is a human's consciousness, right? Some sort of sliding scale. Maybe our consciousness is a raging inferno because we are complex creatures and that
thing with your mic just happened again.
Better?
Okay, it stopped. Yeah, I think we're good. That was a quick fix.
But no, like I was just doing with my light, dimming and then brightening back up, right? Why can't it be a sliding scale? I would argue that most complex organisms have some flicker of consciousness.
Okay.
To what degree, I don't know. To what complexity, I don't know. Obviously, human beings, we tend to have near the top of the scale of complex consciousness, depending on how you look at it, right? Because octopi, they kind of like fit their own little niche, right? There's kind of a half joke that like octopi are aliens because they are so unique and individual in the animal kingdom, and they do seem to have cognitive abilities that maybe don't rival human beings but are next on the list, right?
Yeah.
There's you hear all those anecdotal stories of the octopus at the aquarium that like mapped the time for the guard changes and
So
would
it
get
could
out of
eat the crabs.
Yeah, they'd scuttle across the hall to eat the crabs and come back, and no one was the wiser until they checked the cameras, right?
Yeah.
But, I don't feel it has to be an all or nothing thing. And let's see if I have it here. Where's it at? Here it is. So there's a guy, Dr. Donald Hoffman, who wrote a book. He works out at UCLA, I believe. And he put together a team of mathematicians. So his technical title, he is a neurophysicist, which just sounds terrifying.
Yeah.
But he put together a team of mathematicians because his big thing was the rational atheists, the B.F. Skinners of the world would say that we have all of this material. The objective world is real, right? It has to be measurable in order for it to be true, real, used for rigorous research, whatever. And that's where that reductionist kick comes in, right? We're all just material beings. And you arrange the material in the right way, and all of a sudden it's haunted and can think.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that framework involves two assumptions. It involves an assumption that there is an objective reality, that there is material with which to organize, and that out of the right structure, that material causes consciousness. What Donald Hoffman and his team did is they reversed the order. So they put together, and I'm in no way, shape, or form qualified to read their equations and to tell whether they're accurate or not, but I've read his book. And he suggests that they have mathematical proofs in the mathematical sense, right? Not necessarily proofs as in like philosophical truth or anything like that. That if you grant us the assumption of consciousness as existing, you can do the math to theoretically prove objective reality. So at the very least, per Occam's razor principle, it's the most explanatory value with the least amount of assumptions. You take one of those two core assumptions out. And I think it's really interesting that way because A, it allows for that model of like varying degrees of depth of consciousness. B, it leaves room for higher order beings God, if you want to call it that, whatever, because we don't know. C, most non-Western traditions would agree to some fundamental level, either through tradition or revelatory insight, that we have consciousness and the world arises out of that. Right. So how Donald Hoffman describes it is that we have the fundamental, if you dig down to bedrock in the nature of reality, the fundamental building block of reality is conscious experience and conscious interaction. Right. And it is the sea or the web of all of those conscious entities having experiences that manifest material reality out of. Right. So if you want to think about it in this way, we are all operating in reality with a VR headset on. So what I'm looking at, that material is rendered in a way because of my conscious experience. Not necessarily saying that I'm the creator of it, but we don't know what's out. It's the same way. I'm looking at my computer screen right now. The way that I can understand what my computer is doing is because I have that interface in front of me that takes all of the ionization of gates and capacitors and resistors and chips and hardware that I cannot look at and interact with, and gives me an interface with which to interact with them. Right. Mm-hmm. If we were to peel back everything and look at the fundamental structure of reality, we wouldn't know what to do with it. Partly because our consciousness is embodied, right? And we have this interface that we use.
That reminds me of those scenes in The Matrix where they're looking at the green numbers falling and they can see what it means. But if you haven't been trained to do that, it just looks like numbers.
Right. So it's not suggesting that if I look away, my computer doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. It does. It's just not rendered as a computer. We don't know what it is. No one knows what it is. Right. It kind of goes back to that whole, if I hermetically seal off a room without going into and interacting with that room, can you prove to me that something exists in there? Mm-hmm. And the answer is we can't. That doesn't mean something doesn't exist. It just means that we can't prove one way or the other until we interact with it.
I think, all of that makes sense to me, especially because when I found out that like the retina is processing information, the retina is basically a part of our brain. It is brain tissue, and it processes information and then sends that information through your optic nerve to your brain to get processed some more. But at no point along the stage are we getting raw data. It is hitting our retina and immediately being converted, which is why our vision is so good. We've taken a bit of our brain and placed it at the back of this organ that lets us view a very complex world in a very complex way, allegedly. It may be much more complicated than we are able to see. Actually, we know it is because I can't see the cells that make up my hand, but I know they're there. I can't see the atoms that make up my laptop, but they are there. So we have a baseline level of tools with which to interact with the world. And as humans, we have created additional tools to interact with the world on a smaller level,
such as
and a bigger
language.
Level. Language is a tool. It's the same as a telescope. Like this is how we interact with what's going on.
Let me piggyback off of that because you set me up perfectly for why I find Donald Hoffman so convincing, because the core methodology that he used with which to justify his findings is evolutionary psychology and then game theory. So every mathematical equation that he and his crew put together and inputted into the game theory engine that they have, every single one of them suggested that the participants Right. And so by participants, we mean simulations within their game theory thing. Every player in their game that was evolved to see reality authentically had lower fitness points. We're not, his conclusion from that is, and I find it very convincing, is that we are not evolutionarily designed to see reality as it is. Doing so is crippling, and it actually lowers our success rates in interacting with the world. Rather,
a little bit of ignorance is bliss.
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe not ignorance is bliss, but just in the simple fact that we have evolved to interact with the world in the most predictably accurate way possible in the shortest amount of time possible, which is why we've evolved heuristics. Our eyes, ears, nose, language, tactile experiences, they're all heuristics. They all get filtered, right? And you bringing up the atoms thing is what prompted me for that. We're not evolved to see a computer or a light or a microphone. We're evolved to see density. If I throw my hand through the air, I'm hitting atoms and I can lightly feel it, but it's not threatening, so I can't see it. If I throw my hand through a desk, it's going to break my hand, among other things, because the atoms are more closely packed. It has more impact, literally and metaphorically, on how I navigate through the world. So that's why we see that structure.
That's information we need to know to live. So we are able to get that information, and everything else we can forget about.
Now, it's the same fundamental building blocks, but we're not evolved to see air particles because we don't need to, right? Part of that conscious embodiment. So like you were saying earlier about the computer and the atoms and things like that, language as the tool, here's where things get really, 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 really fun. What is this?
A mug.
Mug, cup, right? What part of this holds the most mug essence?
Is silhouette a choice?
You could say abstract conceptualization, and I would accept that. But no, I did this with... The
handle plus the cup, plus the ceramicness of it.
I did this experiment. I do it a lot with my students. I ask them, like, what is a desk? And they say, oh, it's a table, blah, 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 blah. Okay, well, what is that? I did this with the kids a couple weeks ago at dinner. Like, point to the part of the cup that is most cup or has the most essence of cup in it. And it confuses them because, and this is where Plato's theory of forms comes into play, that cup, that mug, is an embodiment of multiple different layers of being all at the same time. It's ceramic, right? But that's not what makes it a cup. But it wouldn't be a cup if it wasn't embodied ceramic. It has a handle, but that's not what makes it a cup. It holds
cars have
things,
handles,
right? It holds things, but that's not what makes it a cup. Right. Part of what makes this a cup is the relationship between me and it, because it is embodied in such a way that is graspable, because I am embodied in such a way as to grasp something. The most essence, or the word this cup has the most cup essence, is in its abstract conceptualization. When you look at this, you don't see cup, you see drinking device. You see cheers, you see celebration. We see all of these embodied actions that we post hoc apply these material labels on top of, right? You don't look at it and see cup and then infer hydration device, waking up in the morning with coffee, right? We see those things first, and then we infer that heuristic on top of it. Right. It has those stacked layers of all of those different forms, all of those different layers of being all at the same time. And I think tying back to language and things like that, I think that is what turns me off about adhering to Skinner wholly, because I think it eliminates the metaphysical reality of all of those additional abstract layers of being that all of us embody simultaneously.
That's a great way to put it and a great metaphor. I think those categories that we come up with for things are annoyingly subjective. We would like to think cups are cups because they are cups. A cup is anything that holds liquid. But if you put a cup upside down on the table, it no longer has the ability to hold liquid.
Well, and also
still
too,
a cup.
the gas tank in my car holds liquid.
Not a cup.
Right. So at that layer of analysis, right, whether something's a cup or not might be true or false, but it's irrespective of that capability.
Yeah, cups probably don't have wheels, but if you put 4 tiny wheels on something that looks like other cups I've seen, I'll probably still call it a cup, even though I know cups don't have wheels. We have to bend those categories, and it can be very frustrating for people. It can be extremely frustrating for people with autism, because this comes, this is a cup. No, this isn't a cup. And we have to be flexible, even when it is very annoying to do so, because it's hard to have to change our category to fit something new. And it is much easier to just say, no, that's not a cup anymore. It was, and now it's not. And the accuracy may not matter depending on who you are. The ease of which you're able to make that categorization is usually more important. Not for everyone, but for a lot of people.
Yeah, and that's two things on that, and then I think we can start thinking about wrapping this up, because we're coming up on an easy hour and a half, if not close to 2 hours. First of all, that helps explain why we have such a vast vocabulary in basically no matter what cultural language you look at, because there are increasingly, it seems to be a near infinite amount of things that we could refer to. Right. So therefore we need a near infinite amount of words to revert to those specific things.
Right. Should blue cups have a different name than green cups?
Yeah.
Bups and gups.
This is something I get my students to think about when we're talking about synonyms. What's another word for that? Because they're two different words, while there might be a lot of overlap, it's still two different things. Otherwise, it would just be the same word. And another thing, right, you bring up a very accurate and true problem with heuristics, is that they're not one-to-one. Because they can't be. That's the whole point, is to take a high resolution image or experience and to lower the resolution so that way it is transmittable. Right. Otherwise,
it is something humans will try to do at the expense of accuracy. We will try to avoid changing our ideas about a certain thing in order to maintain. It's just easier that way. It takes more energy to change your mind than it does to keep the same mindset. And we're always trying to conserve energy.
Well, and that's why another book I read, or I should say reread in preparation for this, is Joseph Piper's Abusive Language, Abusive Power. He's a Catholic bishop, priest, something like that, wrote a response to the increasing new left movement in the 60s, he recognized how figures such as Herbert Marcuse and the postmodernists were co-opting and redefining words to have dual meanings and things like that. But I like it because it touches on a couple deep metaphysical things. First of all, the fact that in using language, I can transmit a piece of my experience to you, which will therefore alter your experience. Like we mentioned earlier about being bounded and embodied. And if we assume that Donald Hoffman's right in that the objective world that we interact with is the result of underlying conscious experiences, then me transmitting an experience to you is literally changing your metaphysical reality by altering your layers of meaning and all of those layers of being that you interact with. It might not make the table move on its own, but your understanding of what that is going to be changed, and therefore the way you interact with it is going to be changed, and your interaction with reality is going to be changed, therefore changing your reality.
I think this is a really good lesson to take away too, because that will happen without your consent. If someone is talking to you, it will change what you were just saying. It will have an influence. You can't just say, no, it won't. I'm not going to listen to you, because it is going to have an impact, which is why it pays to be very careful about who you're around and who you interact with, and, you know, how long you're on Twitter, how often, who you follow, who your friends are, what media you listen to, because it is having that effect, whether or not you think it is. It can happen without you knowing. It can happen very slowly, it can happen very quickly, but it is happening. And it, you know, we're not as in control of our own actions as we might like to think. And it does pay to change your environment to fit what you would like to embody. Like if I listen to just podcasts about baking, I'm going to know a lot about baking and not a lot about everything else. And if I have an aspiration to be something other than a baker, I need to change my environment to fit that. That's not going to come from within. You have to curate something, deliberately curate something that is going to be safe and healthy and productive for you, which is work. And it can be a hard conversation, like, hey, I can't hang out with you anymore. You're a bad influence. Like, you're racist about this. You have these ideas. Like, we can't be friends anymore. And it pays to set those boundaries, because it's going to happen whether you want it to or not.
Well, it's also doubly difficult too, because while we're sitting here talking about like being better and having determining the valence with which we are growing out of a social experience or social environment or whatever, all of that's predicated on the fact that we are actually properly understanding what is a better position and a worse position, right? We could, through that abusive language, very well have those flipped through our misunderstandings.
Yeah.
The other thing I really like about Joseph Piper's work is the emergence piece. And we'll touch on this really quickly. I'll get your thoughts on it, and then we can wrap it up, because I think we have dived into at least 4 or 5 different Olympic-sized pools of depth in this conversation.
What were we talking about? Language? Oh yeah.
Yeah. But no, that emergence piece, right? So we're sitting here having a conversation, and it is through that manipulation of language that a shared reality emerges. And I know we've talked about this before a little bit. Jacques Panksepp was either Austrian or Hungarian or Polish. Maybe he was Polish. But he was a psychologist that looked at juvenile rats, and he paired them together for play bouts over and over and over. Right. So it was a longitudinal study too. Mm-hmm. That what happened was, after the first play bout, all it took was a 10% weight increase or a 10% weight difference for the bigger rat to win 95% of the time. But after the first bout of play, it became dependent on the smaller rat to do the play bow and initiate that play. Because by definition, it's domination from the other rat, right? So we have that pops up also too. If the big rat doesn't let the little rat win at least a third of the time, the little rat won't initiate play. So even in juvenile rats, we have this emergent morality. We have these two independent creatures that come together, and it's through their being the parts that make the sum that something greater emerges, right? And we can see this with kids, right? Take a group of 4-year-olds that have never met each other before, put them out on a playground and tell them to play tag. They all fundamentally know intuitively, like, the rough rules of tag. If you're it, you tag. If you're not it, you run, right? Mm-hmm. And so, like, they start playing, and then what happens? We start hearing modifications based on this emergent morality that pops up, right? So the kids are running around. One kid just has wicked fast reflexes, and every time he gets tagged. So pay attention. You'll start hearing things like no tag backs, right? Mm-hmm. As everyone else modifies the rules a little bit, not to take the pyramid and the competency hierarchy and flatten it completely, but to flatten it enough to where all participants are having some degree of fun again. Same way, if one kid's particularly fast on his feet, pay attention. You'll hear the group start doing things like, this is base now, you can't tag me while I'm here, right? To have that little island of hope for those kids that know they're not as fast, so that way they can at least have some semblance of fun again. And it's that emergent morality that binds them together. The same way, we have an emergent reality that occurs when we start speaking and having a conversation, because I'm relaying a piece of my reality. You're co-opting it and assimilating it into your reality. And then what comes out afterwards is a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts.
That is interesting. And it makes me wonder, there's something, so operant behavior is one thing, and rule governed behavior is another category that you can have. And it requires language to follow rules. And it sounds like these rats have rule governed behavior. They know if you're the bigger rat, then, and that's kind of the structure of rules, is if this, then. If you speed, then you will get a ticket. That's a rule. Mm-hmm. If I eat, then I will not feel hungry and nauseous. If I smile at someone, they will smile back. And those are all based on verbal behavior. Most of those that I just mentioned are based on our experiences as well, and they can become a rule. But a lot of them, specifically ones for punishment, rules regarding punishment, remain just rules because we avoid punishment and we never experience that. So if I kill someone, then I go to jail. I don't want to go to jail. I'm never going to experience that contingency. So I'm going to follow that rule to avoid that punishment. And what you just described with the children is rules and rule governed behavior. If I tag back, then it's not going to count. So I'm not going to do it. But rats don't have rule governed behavior because they don't have language. So I would be curious to see how because it is the same thing, but I would categorize those as two different types of behavior. The rats are doing operant behavior. The children are doing rule governed behavior, but it looks the exact same. So it's interesting to me to try and make that make sense in my mind. Rats can follow rules, even though they could not tell you what the rule was.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know if this implies that the rats are aware enough, or if it was just Panksepp's observations that after repeated bouts of play, those rats that did not win a third of the time and they were smaller refused to initiate play. And that obviously wasn't communicated and transmitted to all the other rats. I think it was just an observation of the emergent quality of behavior.
Yeah, their behavior is lawful. It is following rules.
Not
even if the rats are not aware.
Yeah, not necessarily. I mean, obviously they do have to follow rules. If they don't eat, they die.
Yeah.
Right. But this isn't suggesting that they're creating a hierarchy of rules and adhering to it just because the big rat, just because there is that loose rule doesn't mean the big rat is going to let the small rat win a third of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Maybe it just does what rats do and it just pins him every time because it's a rat.
Poor little rat. Yeah.
Right. But then what happens is the small rat doesn't have any incentive to play anymore because he knows he's not going to win. And so bouts of play don't continue to occur.
Mm-hmm. For me, that's a lot to think about. Because, yeah, what you described is kind of the exact same behavior, but explaining why each one emerged, to me, they would have to have different reasons for emerging. But they probably don't. They want to have cooperative play.
Well, and yeah, and see that's the thing. I don't think there's fundamentally a big difference per se. There's a living organism that, through biological primers, is pushed to desire social interaction, and there are limits or boundaries to the type of social interaction that living complex creature needs. Right. So rats are social creatures, not communicative per se like people are, although there are mannerisms that we could loosely attribute as communication. But there is that fundamental motivational piece that it is those social interactions that either prompt continued bouts of play or prompt a cessation of play. Right? Incentive structures and all that jazz. Both rats are incentivized to play, not because the Panksepp put them together and said, play in rat speak, and they understood it, but because they have that biological primer, right? The same way that cats play as a way to trigger all of the firing of their muscles and neurons that help them hunt, right? It's instinctual.
It's stimulating. It's nice.
Yeah. But yet when the big rat wins every single time, there's no incentive structure for the small rat to participate in that, at least with that specific participant anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Right. It's whether it's a conscious thought is like, oh, hey, that dude's a dick, I don't want to play with him. Or it's just his physiological response of saying, I'm not getting the rigorous stimulation that I need with which to develop my instincts to be successful in the world. Right. The same way that if you take a kitten that's prone to play and pounce on things and you make it unable to pounce, it's probably not going to continue to try to engage in that behavior because it's not getting any physical reward. It's not helping it hunt anywhere in the future. The cat's not conscious of that, but I would reckon that would be the result. Right. Same thing. The kids are playing because that's what kids do, because A, they need that physical stimulation with which to spur healthy and accurate growth. And B, they need that psychosocial stimulation with which to develop a grounded and stable psychological identity mirrored to their physiological form, so they're complete person, or, however it is you want to frame that.
Yeah. I had to define play for one of my supervisors recently, and I came up with it's age-appropriate social interactions. So you and I play would not be an age-appropriate social interaction, but a child's age-appropriate social interaction we would label as play. But it is just that. It is how they interact with each other.
Are we not playing right now?
Technically, this is an age-appropriate social interaction, so you could say it is play. But we wouldn't call it that because it's usually a term reserved for children.
Because it seems
But-
silly, because we have those social mores and folkways that suggest that if you use an immature term or a term that we would relegate to immature and unfinished peoples that haven't finished their development, right? I don't want to make it sound like I'm alluding to children as incomplete people or anything like that.
Yeah. It's their
Right.
age appropriate social interaction. And we all have something that is age appropriate. And the other reason I like that definition is because it gives the gravity of play, the importance of play to children. It is not just a fun activity that they do. It's not a reward.
No. It's
something
absolutely
they
essential.
need.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. They would not thrive without it.
We see this in my classroom. I have my 9th graders this year because they have not had, this is my hypothesis for why things are so crazy right now, at least in the public school system, because they have not had their normal psychosocial play experiences. They haven't had a normal school year since the first half of 7th grade. They have not been able to psychologically develop past that step because we don't skip steps in our psychological development. We complete the previous stage before we move up to the next layer. So on any given day, most of the behaviors manifested in my classroom are those of first half of the year 7th graders. Right? Because they have not had those opportunities. That's why I do let a lot of play go farther than I should in my classroom for all intents and purposes. Because I realized at the start of the year that if I'm the hard-fisted tyrant as soon as they start acting out and I say sit down and shut up, that doesn't teach them why those behaviors are bad. If they start pissing off all their peers and they start getting that peer feedback, if they are allowed to play under the supportive umbrella to make sure that they're not going to walk away bleeding because the teacher's in the room, then they learn those social boundaries a lot faster and more thoroughly.
Yeah. And kind of what you're touching on is like rule governed versus contingency shaped behavior. You can tell them, follow this rule, don't tell a joke twice because it's not funny the second time. People won't laugh. You won't get the same reaction. You can tell them that. But if they actually experience that, that is always going to be stronger than just being told this is how it is. So you can sit someone down and read them a book on social interactions, but unless they do it, it is not going to be as strong or as accurate or as they have to do it. It's got to be learned through experience.
No,
so you're touching on the exact right thing. Like they didn't get that experience and they won't be able to move on until they get that experience. So it's got to happen.
Which isn't scary. What scares me about it is within 2 or 3 years, if we look at statistics, some of these 9th grade maturity of 7th grade kids in my classroom will be having kids of their own. So that psychosocial deficiency is going to be transmitted to the next generation, which is going to be raised with the psychosocial deficiency. That will in turn, if we can't course correct, exponentially expand that to the following generation and the following generation. Like we're only talking about 2 or 3 generations before we as a general population don't have enough social maturity to interact as a society anymore.
Yeah, I do. My opinion is that humans are extremely resilient and children are especially resilient. And, we don't give teenagers enough credit for their resilience, but they can bounce back from a lot and come out perfectly okay. And it's never too late to learn that integral skill. I've taught 17-year-olds to say their first word, and by a textbook, that shouldn't be possible. They're too old to have learned that. They're past that point, but they always
You're
can.
saying we can teach an old dog new tricks.
Oh, yes. It's
Okay.
It's not the best way to do it. Learn it when you're supposed to. But if you didn't learn it, you can still get there.
Yeah. we can do a shopkeeping conversation after I stop recording, but is there any last words or anything else you want to touch on this topic before we call it quits?
I mean, there's a lot there, obviously. So it's never, of all of the theories that are out there, I don't think there's one who's got it yet for anything. I think that the better our tools get, the more complicated our computers get, the more accurate our simulations get, the closer we'll get. But it is, all the information that we have now and everything that we talked about today could be completely outdated in 5 years, in 10 years. So it's nice to have these conversations within the context that this is what I think right now. And I would like to reserve the right to change my opinion as we get more information, as we learn more.
Well, and I think fundamentally that's what good academics do. When presented with additional information, they adjust their conclusions accordingly. That doesn't mean that the initial conclusion can be wrong, right? Maybe the additional information isn't sufficient enough with which to rewrite the whole schema.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's overwhelming. Either way, being able to have that epistemic humility to recognize that we should base our conclusions off of the most comprehensive and explanatory evidence that we have, regardless of personal opinion or biases or interests.
Yeah. Isn't that a beautiful little undermining of like, oh, also, if I'm wrong.
Yeah. Hey, here's this 2 hour upper undergraduate, lower graduate level seminar philosophical discussion about language and the nature of reality. By the way, just in case we're wrong about all of it, you can't blame us.
Yeah, if it's bullshit, you shouldn't have listened. So, yeah, that's my final thought.